On a cold November afternoon in 1982, in the Magnolia neighborhood of Seattle, Washington, a discovery was made that would haunt detectives for more than 2 decades. Behind a small television repair shop, hidden among the everyday refuse of urban life, lay the body of a teenage girl. Discarded like trash, her life stolen, her story silenced. Her name was Kristine Sumstad. For 22 years, her killer walked free. He built a new life, moved across the country, and believed he had gotten away with murder. He had no idea that advances in science, technology that didn't even exist when he committed his crime, would eventually reach across 2 decades and thousands of miles to bring him to justice. But this isn't just a story about DNA. It's about the ingenuity of investigators who refused to let a case die, the persistence of detectives who turned over every stone, and a brilliant, controversial police tactic that would change the landscape of cold case investigations forever. This is the story of how a simple envelope and the DNA left on it sealed the fate of a killer who thought he'd never be caught. Before we dive deeper into this haunting case, if you're fascinated by true crime stories and the incredible detective work that solves cold cases, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you meticulously researched cases every week, and your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Let's build a community of true crime enthusiasts from around the world. Now, let's go back to where it all began. November 1982 in Seattle, Washington. Seattle in the early 1980s was a city in transition. The aerospace industry was struggling, unemployment was high, and the streets of neighborhoods like Magnolia, once considered safe and family-friendly, were seeing changes that made parents worry. The era of letting children roam freely was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the dangers that lurked in seemingly ordinary places. Kristine Sumstad knew those streets well. She was a teenage girl navigating the complicated terrain of adolescence in a world that was becoming increasingly uncertain. Those who knew her described a young person who sometimes struggled with the boundaries between childhood and independence. She had a history of staying away from home overnight, of testing limits, of seeking freedom in a way that concerned her family. Multiple times she had been reported as a runaway, though she always returned. But this time would be different. 2 days before her body was discovered, Kristine had left for school, just like any other morning. It was a routine trip, one she'd made hundreds of times before. Her family had no reason to believe this day would be any different from all the others. They had no way of knowing that she would never make it home again. When Kristine didn't return, her family's initial reaction was complicated by history. Given her past disappearances, there was a terrible, tragic hope that she had simply run away again, that she would come back when she was ready, as she had before. But as hours turned into days, that hope began to dim. The discovery came on a November afternoon that would forever be etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. Behind Magnolia TV, a television repair shop in the neighborhood, someone made a grim discovery while disposing of trash. In a large garbage container, partially concealed beneath smaller boxes and refuse, was the body of a young girl. It was Kristine. The crime scene told a brutal story. This was no accident, no tragedy of circumstance. Kristine had been murdered. The evidence was clear and devastating. She had been sexually assaulted before her death. Someone had violated this young girl in the most horrific way possible, taken her life, and then attempted to hide her body among the garbage, as if she were something to be discarded and forgotten. The location was significant. Magnolia TV sat in a neighborhood where people knew each other, where the same faces appeared day after day, where a stranger would be noticed. The alley behind the shop wasn't a random dumping ground. It was a specific location that suggested some level of familiarity with the area. The killer either lived nearby, worked nearby, or had reason to know about this particular spot. Seattle Police Department detectives descended on the scene immediately. This was every investigator's nightmare. A young victim, a brutal sexual assault, and a killer who had shown a chilling level of calculation in disposing of the body. The clock was ticking. In murder investigations, the first 48 hours are critical. Evidence degrades, memories fade, and killers put distance between themselves and their crimes. The initial investigation was thorough and extensive. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with residents, business owners, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. They were looking for anything out of the ordinary: a stranger in the area, a suspicious vehicle, unusual activity around the time Kristine went missing. Physical evidence was collected from the crime scene and from Kristine's body. This was 1982, years before DNA analysis would become a standard tool in criminal investigations. The technology that would eventually solve this case didn't exist yet, or at least it existed only in research laboratories, not in police departments. But investigators collected everything anyway, following protocols and preserving evidence with a thoroughness that would prove crucial 2 decades later. Among the evidence collected was semen, recovered during the examination of Kristine's body. In 1982, this evidence could be typed using conventional serology, determining blood type from bodily fluids, but it couldn't provide the definitive identification that DNA analysis would later offer. Still, it was preserved, cataloged, and stored, waiting for a future technology that investigators could barely imagine. Detectives worked every angle. They looked into Kristine's background, her friends, her activities. They sought to understand her movements in those final days, to piece together who she had been with, where she had gone, what had led her to that alley behind Magnolia TV. They interviewed family members, school friends, neighbors, anyone who might provide a clue. And then they found their first significant lead. Witnesses came forward with information about a young person seen in the area around the time of Kristine's disappearance. This individual had been spotted pushing a shopping cart near the crime scene, unusual behavior that caught people's attention. In any investigation, unusual behavior gets noticed, gets remembered, gets reported. The person of interest was someone who knew Kristine. In fact, he was a family friend of the Sumstads, a boy named John Athen, just 14 years old. John was brought in for questioning. For detectives, this was a delicate situation. John was a minor, a boy who was friends with the victim's family, but he had been seen in the right place at the right time, engaged in behavior that seemed odd. The shopping cart he'd been pushing was particularly interesting. It could have been used to transport something, or someone, to the dumpster where Kristine's body was found. Detectives pressed John about his whereabouts, about the shopping cart, about his relationship with Kristine. But they were limited in how hard they could push. He was 14 years old. He was questioned, his story was documented, and he was noted as a person of interest in the case. But there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, no witness who had actually seen him with Kristine, no confession. The shopping cart and his presence in the area were suspicious, certainly, but suspicion isn't evidence. In the American justice system, suspicion doesn't lead to convictions. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. Despite the dedicated efforts of detectives, despite hundreds of hours of work, no arrest was made. The case remained open, but active leads dried up. Without new evidence or new witnesses, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. Kristine Sumstad's case went cold. For her family, this meant living with an unbearable reality. knowing that their daughter had been murdered, that someone had violated and killed her, and that person was walking free. They had no answers, no justice, no closure, just the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there a killer had gotten away with it. And for John Athen, life went on. If he was indeed the killer, and he had every reason to believe he had escaped justice, he had learned a powerful lesson. He could commit the perfect crime. 2 decades is a long time. Think about your life 20 years ago. Think about how much has changed, where you lived, who you knew, what you did for a living. 20 years is enough time to build an entire life, to become a completely different person, to leave the past behind and create a new future. That's exactly what John Athen did. In the years following Kristine Sumstad's murder, John left Seattle. He left Washington state entirely, putting thousands of miles between himself and the crime scene. He moved to the East Coast, eventually settling in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, a small borough situated on the Hudson River directly across from Manhattan. It was about as far from Seattle as one could get, both geographically and culturally. In New Jersey, John built a new life. He found work as a construction worker, operating heavy machinery like backhoes. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary person living an ordinary life. The people who knew him in Cliffside Park had no idea about his past, about the questions that had swirled around him in 1982, about the teenage girl whose murder had gone unsolved. 20 years is also enough time for technology to evolve in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1982. When Kristine Sumstad was murdered, DNA analysis was in its infancy. The structure of DNA had been known since 1953, but using it for forensic identification was revolutionary. The first use of DNA profiling in a criminal case had occurred in 1986 in England, 4 years after Kristine's death. By the 1990s, DNA analysis was becoming more common in criminal investigations, but many police departments still lacked the resources, training, and databases to use it effectively. The creation of CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, in 1990 marked a turning point. This FBI-operated database allowed law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with DNA profiles of convicted offenders. As more and more jurisdictions adopted DNA collection from convicted criminals, the database grew, and with it, the possibility of solving cold cases. By the early 2000s, police departments across America were beginning to revisit old cases with new eyes. Evidence that had been collected decades earlier, before DNA analysis was available, was being re-examined. Cases that had gone cold were being reopened. Families who had given up hope were being contacted with news they'd never expected to hear. We're taking another look at your loved one's case. In 2002, 20 years after Kristine Sumstad's murder, Seattle Police Department detectives made the decision to reopen her case. The detective assigned to review Kristine's case in 2002 understood what 20 years of technological advancement meant. The evidence that had been collected in 1982, particularly the semen recovered from Kristine's body, could now be analyzed in ways that were impossible when the crime was committed. The first step was to create a DNA profile from the preserved evidence. This wasn't always straightforward with old evidence. DNA degrades over time, especially if it hasn't been stored under optimal conditions. There was no guarantee that after 2 decades, the sample would still be viable. But the Seattle Crime Lab had done its job well. The evidence had been properly preserved, and despite its age, it was still usable. Technicians were able to extract DNA and create a profile, a genetic fingerprint of Kristine Sumstad's killer. This was a major breakthrough, but it was only the first step. Having a DNA profile was meaningless unless there was something to compare it to. The detective's next move was to run the profile through CODIS, hoping for a match with a convicted offender. The result came back. No match. This was disappointing but not surprising. CODIS only contained profiles of convicted offenders. If Kristine's killer had never been arrested and convicted of another crime, he wouldn't be in the system. The database was growing every day, but it wasn't comprehensive, not yet, and perhaps not ever. The detective faced a critical decision. The DNA profile was solid, definitive evidence that would absolutely identify the killer, but only if they could obtain a comparison sample. How do you get DNA from someone when you don't have probable cause to arrest them, when they're not in any database, when they may not even be on your radar anymore? The answer lay in the original investigation files. Cold case work is often about returning to the beginning, re-examining the initial investigation with fresh eyes and new tools. The detective began reviewing every document, every interview, every piece of information collected in 1982. Who had been questioned? Who had been considered a suspect? Were there any leads that hadn't been fully pursued? And there in the files from 20 years earlier was the name John Athen. The notes from 1982 were clear. John had been a person of interest. He'd been seen in the area with a shopping cart. He'd been questioned but never charged. He'd been 14 years old at the time, a minor, a friend of the family, someone who might have seemed too young to commit such a brutal crime. But now, 20 years later, with a DNA profile in hand, that 14-year-old boy had become a 34-year-old man, and if he was the killer, he had been living free for 2 decades while Kristine's family suffered without justice. The detective began the process of locating John Athen. This was detective work in the age of technology, cross-referencing databases, following paper trails, tracking someone across state lines in 20 years of time. It wasn't easy, but it was possible in ways it wouldn't have been in 1982. John Athen was found living in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. He was working construction, operating a backhoe, living what appeared to be a normal, law-abiding life. There was no indication he'd been in trouble with the law, no criminal record that would have put his DNA in CODIS. Now the detective faced the central challenge of the investigation: how to get John Athen's DNA without tipping him off that he was under investigation for a murder committed 2 decades ago. We're about to reveal the ingenious and controversial tactic that detectives used to catch a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder. But first, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the Kristine Sumstad case, please take a moment to like this video and share it with anyone who loves true crime. These cases deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us continue bringing you these important stories. Don't forget to leave a comment with your location. We love connecting with viewers from all over the world. Now, let's talk about the envelope that would change everything. The detective working Kristine Sumstad's cold case faced a dilemma that was becoming increasingly common in the early 2000s. DNA technology had advanced to the point where it could definitively identify suspects, but obtaining DNA from those suspects, particularly when they didn't know they were under investigation, required creativity. In 2003, there were fewer legal restrictions on how police could obtain DNA samples. The extensive legal frameworks and precedents regarding genetic privacy that exist today were still being developed. This was both an opportunity and an ethical gray area. The detective needed John Athen's DNA, but approaching him directly was out of the question. Asking for a voluntary sample would alert him to the investigation, potentially causing him to flee or destroy evidence. Arresting him without probable cause was impossible. The fact that he'd been questioned 20 years ago wasn't enough. Following him around and waiting for him to discard something with his DNA on it, a cigarette butt, a coffee cup, a napkin, was theoretically possible, but could take weeks or months with no guarantee of success. So the detective devised a plan that was simple, ingenious, and completely legal under the laws of the time. And they would send John Athen a letter, but not just any letter. It would be a letter so compelling, so seemingly important that he would almost certainly respond to it. And in responding, he would unknowingly provide exactly what the detective needed: his DNA. The plan required creating a completely fictional scenario. Detectives drafted a letter on professional letterhead, designed to look like it came from a legitimate law firm. The letter informed John Athen that he was potentially entitled to money as part of a class action lawsuit settlement. All he needed to do was fill out the enclosed form and return it in the prepaid envelope provided. The psychology behind this approach was brilliant. Class action lawsuits were common enough that the premise was believable. The promise of money, even a small amount, is compelling to most people. The official-looking letterhead and the prepaid return envelope added legitimacy. Everything about the letter was designed to make John Athen believe it was real and worth responding to. But the actual purpose of the letter had nothing to do with a lawsuit or settlement. The purpose was the envelope. When John Athen licked the envelope to seal it and mailed it back, his saliva would be on that envelope flap, and saliva contains DNA. In March 2003, the letter was sent to John Athen's address in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. Then came the waiting. Would he respond? Would he see through the ruse? Would the letter even reach him? The answer came within weeks. An envelope arrived, the return envelope from the fake law firm's mailing. John Athen had taken the bait. The envelope was handled with extreme care. It was sent to the crime lab where technicians swabbed the sealed flap, extracting cells from the saliva John had left behind when he licked it. From those cells, they extracted DNA and created a profile. Then came the moment of truth, comparing the DNA from the envelope to the DNA profile created from the semen found on Kristine Sumstad's body in 1982. It was a match. Not a partial match, not a probable match, but a definitive, conclusive, no doubt about it match. The odds of it being anyone other than John Athen were astronomical, essentially impossible. After 22 years, Kristine Sumstad's killer had been identified with scientific certainty. The boy who had been questioned in 1982, who had been seen pushing a shopping cart near the crime scene, who had been a person of interest but never charged, he was the murderer. May 2003. Cliffside Park, New Jersey. John Athen, now 34 years old, was at work on a construction site operating a backhoe when law enforcement arrived. For 22 years he had lived with the knowledge of what he'd done, if indeed he had thought about it at all. Perhaps he believed he'd gotten away with it. Perhaps he convinced himself it never happened or that he'd never be caught. Perhaps he'd built walls in his mind, compartmentalizing that day in 1982, separating it from the life he'd built in New Jersey. Whatever he believed, whatever walls he constructed, they all came crashing down when detectives approached him with an arrest warrant. John Athen was arrested for the murder of Kristine Sumstad. He was extradited back to Seattle, Washington, to face trial for a crime committed when he was 14 years old, a crime the state would prove he'd committed using evidence he'd voluntarily provided without even knowing it. The arrest made news both in New Jersey and in Seattle. In Cliffside Park, neighbors and co-workers were shocked. The man they knew, a construction worker, an ordinary guy, was accused of murdering a teenage girl more than 2 decades ago. It seemed impossible. In Seattle, the news was different. For those who remembered the case, for Kristine's family and friends, for the detectives who had worked the original investigation, this was a moment of profound relief mixed with anger. Finally, after 22 years, there would be accountability. Finally, there would be answers. But an arrest is not a conviction. The legal system doesn't work that way. John Athen would have his day in court, and prosecutors would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had murdered Kristine Sumstad. In many ways, though, the DNA evidence made this an open and shut case. The science was solid, the match was definitive, and there was no innocent explanation for why John Athen's DNA would be present as semen on Kristine Sumstad's body. This wasn't a case of contaminated evidence or distant familial matches or complex statistical probabilities. This was simple and clear. John Athen had sexually assaulted and murdered Kristine Sumstad. But trials are about more than just evidence. They're about narratives, about presenting a story that a jury can understand and believe. Prosecutors had to do more than present DNA results. They had to reconstruct what happened on that day in November 1982. They had to explain how a 14-year-old boy could commit such a brutal crime. They had to counter any defense arguments about the reliability of old evidence, about the methods used to obtain John's DNA, about reasonable doubt. January 2004, 22 years and 2 months after Kristine Sumstad's body was found behind Magnolia TV, John Athen went on trial for her murder. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. First and foremost was the DNA evidence, the match between the semen recovered from Kristine's body in 1982 and the DNA obtained from the envelope John had licked in 2003. This was presented with scientific rigor, with expert witnesses explaining how DNA analysis works, how profiles are created, how matches are determined, and what the statistical probability of a false match was. The numbers were staggering. The probability that someone other than John Athen had left that DNA was so infinitesimally small as to be essentially impossible. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or eyewitness testimony that could be unreliable. This was science, cold and definitive. But the prosecution knew that juries, especially in the early 2000s, might not fully understand DNA evidence. It was still relatively new in the public consciousness. Television shows like CSI were making forensic science popular, but they were also creating unrealistic expectations about how quickly results could be obtained and how certain they were. Prosecutors had to make the science accessible without oversimplifying it, convincing without being condescending. The second pillar of the prosecution's case was the original investigation. Detectives testified about John being seen near the crime scene with a shopping cart. Witnesses from 1982 were brought in to recount what they'd seen. The original evidence collection process was explained, establishing a chain of custody for the DNA evidence that had been preserved for 2 decades. The shopping cart was particularly significant. The prosecution argued that John had used it to transport Kristine's body to the dumpster. A 14-year-old boy would have struggled to carry a dead body, but a shopping cart would have made it possible. The fact that he'd been seen with a cart in the area at the time Kristine disappeared was damning. The third pillar was the method by which John's DNA had been obtained, the fake law firm letter. This was potentially the most controversial aspect of the case, and the defense seized on it. The defense argued that the police had used deception to obtain John's DNA, that this was unethical and potentially illegal, that it represented a violation of his rights. They argued that the evidence should be suppressed, thrown out, because of how it was obtained. This raised fascinating questions about the intersection of law, ethics, and police work. Was it legal for police to send a fake letter? Yes, it was. Courts had consistently held that police could use deception in investigations as long as they didn't violate specific constitutional rights. Was it ethical? That was a more complex question, one that sparked debate in legal circles and among the public. Ultimately, the judge ruled that the evidence was admissible. John Athen had not been coerced or forced to provide his DNA. He had voluntarily licked the envelope and sent it back. The fact that he didn't know the true purpose of the letter didn't make it unconstitutional. The police had not entered his home, had not conducted an illegal search, had not violated his Fourth Amendment rights. They had simply sent a letter, and he had responded. The defense had to pivot. If they couldn't suppress the DNA evidence, they had to challenge it in other ways. They questioned the reliability of evidence stored for 20 years. They suggested the possibility of contamination. They raised doubts about the chain of custody. They brought in their own experts to contest the prosecution's scientific witnesses. But none of it was enough to overcome the fundamental fact. John Athen's DNA matched the DNA of Kristine Sumstad's killer, and there was no innocent explanation for that match. The defense also had to contend with the age issue. John had been 14 when the crime was committed. Could a 14-year-old commit such a brutal sexual assault and murder? The prosecution argued that, yes, absolutely. Age doesn't preclude violence, and there are well-documented cases of teenagers committing horrific crimes. The sexual component suggested someone going through puberty, experiencing sexual urges but lacking the maturity, empathy, and self-control to manage them appropriately. The trial lasted several weeks. Dozens of witnesses testified. Hundreds of pieces of evidence were presented. The jury heard from DNA experts, original investigators, witnesses from 1982, and forensic specialists. They saw photos from the crime scene, learned about Kristine's life and death, and heard arguments about what all this evidence meant. Then came deliberations. The jury retired to consider the evidence and reach a verdict. This was no quick decision. They deliberated for 12 days, an unusually long period that suggested they were taking their responsibility seriously, weighing every piece of evidence, considering every argument. 12 days of deliberation meant 12 days of waiting for Kristine's family, 12 days of uncertainty for John Athen, 12 days of second-guessing for the prosecutors and defense attorneys, and then, finally, the jury reached a verdict. When the jury returned to the courtroom after 12 days of deliberation, the tension was palpable. This was a case that had spanned more than 2 decades, that had gone cold and been resurrected, that had relied on cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned detective work. The verdict: guilty of murder in the second degree. John Athen had been convicted of murdering Kristine Sumstad. After 22 years, there was finally accountability, finally justice, or at least the closest thing to justice that the legal system could provide. Murder in the second degree, rather than first degree, suggested the jury believed the killing had not been premeditated. The evidence indicated a crime of opportunity, perhaps an assault that escalated to murder rather than a carefully planned killing. This distinction would affect sentencing but didn't change the fundamental reality. John Athen had been found responsible for Kristine's death. The sentencing reflected the complexity of the case. John was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, a significant sentence, but one that some felt was inadequate given the nature of the crime. The sentence took into account that John had been 14 at the time of the offense, even though he was now being punished as an adult. It reflected the challenge of sentencing someone for a crime committed in adolescence, judged by standards that apply to adults. For Kristine Sumstad's family, the verdict and sentence brought complicated emotions. Relief that someone had finally been held accountable. Anger that it had taken 22 years. Sadness that no amount of justice could bring Kristine back, could undo the horror of what had been done to her, could give her back the life she should have lived. Kristine would have been in her 40s by the time of the trial. She might have had a career, a family, children of her own. She might have achieved her dreams, whatever they were. Instead, her life had been cut short at the cusp of adulthood in the most brutal way imaginable. The Kristine Sumstad case became a landmark in the annals of cold case investigations, not just for the resolution it brought to one family, but for what it demonstrated about the evolving relationship between technology, detective work, and justice. The use of the fake law firm letter to obtain DNA was particularly significant. This tactic, often called a ruse or pretext operation, became a template that other departments adopted. In the years following John Athen's conviction, numerous cold cases were solved using similar methods. Suspects were sent fake letters about everything from class action lawsuits to genealogical surveys to sweepstakes winnings. Each letter had the same real purpose: getting the recipient to lick an envelope. The tactic was so successful that it sparked a legal and ethical debate that continues today. Is it acceptable for police to deceive people into providing DNA? Where is the line between legitimate investigative technique and improper manipulation? Should there be regulations governing these practices? Different jurisdictions have answered these questions differently. Some states have passed laws restricting how police can obtain DNA from suspects. Some courts have ruled that such evidence is inadmissible under certain circumstances. The legal landscape remains complex and evolving. But regardless of one's position on the ethics of the tactic, it's impossible to deny its effectiveness. Dozens of cold cases, murders, rapes, violent crimes that had gone unsolved for years or decades have been resolved using DNA obtained through similar methods. Families who had given up hope have received answers. Killers who believed they'd gotten away with their crimes have been brought to justice. The Kristine Sumstad case also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation. If the Seattle Police Department hadn't carefully stored the biological evidence from 1982, if it had degraded or been lost or discarded during one of many moves or reorganizations over 20 years, John Athen would never have been caught. The case demonstrated why departments need clear protocols for storing evidence, even from cases that seem unsolvable at the time. It's worth noting that not all old cases can be solved, even with modern DNA technology. Sometimes evidence hasn't been preserved. Sometimes it has degraded beyond usefulness. Sometimes there's no biological evidence at all. Sometimes the DNA doesn't match anyone in any database, and there's no early suspect to focus on. The stars have to align in specific ways for a cold case to be resolved decades after the fact. But when it works, when careful evidence preservation combines with advancing technology and creative detective work, the results can be remarkable. Despite the conviction, despite the DNA match, despite the resolution of the case, questions remain about what exactly happened on that day in November 1982. The DNA proved that John Athen had sexually assaulted Kristine and that he was responsible for her death. But it didn't explain the how or why. It didn't reveal what led to the encounter between a 14-year-old boy and a teenage girl. It didn't explain the sequence of events that ended with Kristine's body in a dumpster. Was this a crime of opportunity? John encountering Kristine by chance, perhaps offering to walk with her, then attacking her? Or was it something else? A planned assault that a 14-year-old somehow conceived and executed. The shopping cart suggests it's premeditation to some degree. It was a tool for transporting the body. But did John bring the cart intending to use it for that purpose, or did he improvise, finding it nearby after the murder and using it to solve the problem of what to do with Kristine's body? These questions matter less in a legal sense. The conviction stands regardless, but they matter for understanding the psychology of the crime and the killer. They matter for anyone trying to comprehend how someone so young could commit such an act. John Athen has never publicly discussed the crime in detail. He has never provided a confession that explained his motives or described exactly what happened. Without his cooperation, much of what occurred that day remains speculation, a void that can never be completely filled. The Kristine Sumstad case didn't occur in isolation. It was part of a larger pattern of violence against young people in America in the early 1980s. This was an era before Amber Alerts, before national databases of missing children, before the kind of coordinated response to child endangerment that we have today. The 1980s saw heightened public awareness of dangers to children. The murder of Adam Walsh in 1981, which led to the creation of the Adam Walsh Child Resource Center, and eventually to America's Most Wanted, marked a turning point in how America thought about child safety. The Milk Carton Missing Children campaign began in the early 1980s. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was founded in 1984. Kristine's murder occurred in the middle of this shift in consciousness, at a time when society was beginning to recognize that children faced real dangers, that stranger danger and acquaintance danger were both real threats, and that new approaches were needed to protect young people. The fact that John Athen was a family friend makes this case particularly tragic and particularly illustrative of a hard truth. Most violence against children comes not from strangers, but from people they know. Statistics consistently show that children are far more likely to be harmed by family members, friends, or acquaintances than by strangers. The emphasis on stranger danger in the 1980s and 1990s, while well-intentioned, sometimes obscured this reality. If John Athen's status as a family friend made him seem less suspicious in 1982, that was a reflection of the biases and assumptions of the time. Surely a boy from a good family, someone the Sumstads knew and trusted, couldn't be capable of such brutality. That assumption may have contributed to why he wasn't pursued more vigorously as a suspect initially. Today, investigators are trained to look past such assumptions, to evaluate evidence objectively, regardless of the suspect's relationship to the victim or their standing in the community. But in 1982, these lessons hadn't been fully learned. The Kristine Sumstad case raises important questions about DNA, privacy, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting civil liberties, questions that have only become more pressing in the decades since John Athen's conviction. When police used a fake letter to obtain John's DNA, they were operating in a legal gray area that has since become more defined. Courts have generally upheld the principle that people don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA. They voluntarily leave in public places or on items they discard. This is called the abandoned DNA doctrine. But is licking an envelope in response to a deceptive letter really abandoning your DNA? Is it truly voluntary if you don't know the real purpose? These questions have been litigated in various courts with varying results. The rise of consumer genetic testing, services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, has added new dimensions to this debate. These companies maintain databases of millions of DNA profiles voluntarily submitted by consumers interested in learning about their ancestry or health. Law enforcement has increasingly used these databases to identify suspects through familial DNA matching, even though the DNA samples weren't submitted by the suspects themselves. The Golden State Killer case, solved in 2018 using this technique, brought the practice into the spotlight. It was hailed as brilliant detective work by some and condemned as a violation of genetic privacy by others. The debate continues about whether this represents legitimate use of publicly available information or a dangerous erosion of privacy rights. The Kristine Sumstad case was an early example of law enforcement adapting to the possibilities of DNA technology, pushing boundaries, testing what was legally and ethically permissible in the pursuit of justice. In many ways, it set the stage for the debates and controversies that would follow. In telling the story of how Kristine Sumstad's murder was solved, it's important not to lose sight of who she was. Not just a victim, not just a case file, but a person with her own hopes, dreams, and potential. Kristine was a teenage girl navigating the challenges of adolescence. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who laughed and cried and lived, however briefly. Her life mattered not because of how it ended, but because of what it was and what it could have been. The fact that it took 22 years to bring her killer to justice is a tragedy layered upon tragedy. Her family had to wait more than 2 decades for answers, living with uncertainty and grief all that time. They missed her through all those years, through holidays and birthdays, through milestones she should have reached but never did. But the resolution of the case, delayed as it was, matters. It matters that John Athen was held accountable. It matters that the truth came out. It matters that advances in technology and determined detective work made it possible to solve a case that had seemed unsolvable. The envelope that John Athen licked in 2003, responding to a fake letter about a fictional lawsuit, sealed more than just a piece of mail. It sealed his fate, confirming what detectives had suspected 22 years earlier, providing the proof needed to finally bring him to justice. In the end, this case is a testament to persistence, the persistence of detectives who wouldn't let the case die, the persistence of science in revealing truth, the persistence of justice even when it's delayed for decades. Kristine Sumstad deserved better than what happened to her in 1982. She deserved to live a full life, to realize her potential, to experience all the joys and challenges that life offers. She deserved justice when she was killed, not 22 years later. But if justice delayed is better than justice denied, then perhaps there is some solace in knowing that eventually, finally, the truth caught up with her killer. An envelope, a DNA match, and the determined work of investigators who refused to give up. These were the tools that brought that truth to light. And in doing so, they ensured that Kristine Sumstad would not be forgotten, that her case would matter, and that even decades after her death, her life would be honored through the pursuit of justice in her name. The Kristine Sumstad case reminds us that cold cases are never truly closed until they're solved. Families never stop grieving, never stop wondering, never stop hoping for answers. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, those answers come, even decades later. If you or someone you know has information about an unsolved case, please reach out to law enforcement. You never know what small piece of information might be the key to solving a case, to giving a family closure, to bringing a killer to justice. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Kristine Sumstad case. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. These stories deserve to be told, and your support makes that possible. Rest in peace, Kristine Sumstad. You are not forgotten.